Hi, I'm Brooke Thackeray. Welcome to What's Hot and What's Not in the month of June. Let's jump right in and take a look at some of the seasonal trends for the month of June and also where we stand right now in the market as well. So let's go to my Thackeray's 2023 Investors Guide. We're going to start by taking a look at the S&P 500 seasonal trend for the month of June from 1990 or 1950, I should say, to 2022. You can see on average, every June is different, of course, but on average, you tend to see an uptick in the first few days of June. And we're shooting this video on June the 6th, or I should say June the 5th. And that's exactly what we've seen so far. And then we see a slightly negative trend for the S&P 500 for most of June. And then we start to see a rally here towards the end of June. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because the first part of July tends to be positive on a seasonal basis as well. So there could be an opportunity there. But seasonally, the market, the S&P 500 tends to be weaker for most of June. This table shows the performance of the sectors of the S&P 500 from 1990 to 2022. They're ranked on the average greatest gain for the month of June. You can see here, on average, the healthcare sector tends to be the top performing sector according to its gain. And this last column here represents how often the sector has outperformed the S&P 500, which is a very important statistic, actually. And you can see here, the healthcare sector on average has produced a 0.6% gain and has outperformed the S&P 500 64% of the time. Healthcare sector didn't perform so well in the month of May, so this could be a good setup for the healthcare sector, especially relative to the market for the month of June. Telecom as well, so another defensive sector. Information technology. The tech sector has had a huge run, but I do want to point out something here. Even though it is one of the top 3 performing sectors, it's only outperformed the S&P 500 39% of the time. So what that means is when it's outperformed, it's done extremely well, pushing up the average gain here. But on average, it does not outperform the S&P 500 in the month of June. So something to watch out for this time around, especially with the performance of the technology stocks that have happened recently as well. And we come down to consumer staples as well. This is an interesting one because it's a defensive sector, but look at this. It only outperforms the S&P 500 36% of the time. The consumer staple sector recently hasn't been performing well. Probably the healthcare sector and the telecom sector could be better on a seasonal basis versus the consumer staple sector. Then we have utilities as well. And we jump right down here. Let's just jump down to the bottom. Here's some of the cyclical sectors: industrials, material, financials. So the financial sector, interestingly enough, does not tend to perform well in June. It has only outperformed the S&P 500 36% of the time and produced an average gain of negative 1.2% as well. And the material sector as well tends to underperform in the month of June as well. So something to watch out for. Let's take a look at some of the selected subsectors in the month of June. The performance from 1990 to 2022. Pharma tends to perform well. That's part of the healthcare sector, of course. Retail, which is interesting because retail has not been performing well recently for a number of different reasons. Gold. Now, gold is up here, but it tends to be very volatile in June. It starts a strong seasonal period in July. I'm going to be writing about that in my next newsletter coming up very shortly. Spending a little more time on that because gold could be presenting a good opportunity. Biotech. Biotech's up here. It only outperforms the S&P 500 52% of the time. It starts a strong seasonal period later in June, and then July tends to be a very strong month for the biotech sector. Sometimes it can start early. The stocks or the semiconductor sector, look at this, only outperforms the S&P 500 39% of the time, but it's still one of the top performing subsectors I've got selected here. So when it outperforms, as it has been recently, it can drag up that number as well. Metals and mining here, around 50% of the time, outperforming the S&P 500. Let's just go down here and take a look at some of the sectors in the bottom. Chemicals really weak in the month of June. Agriculture as well tends to be weak. Banks, look at that. Banks only outperforming the S&P 500 30% of the time. With everything that's going on right now for the U.S. banks, this might be the month that could present an opportunity for some for longer term investors to get into as well. But you have to be careful from a seasonal perspective because it does the sector does not perform well at this time. And silver here, generally speaking, the metals don't perform that well, and silver tends to be an underperformer in the month of June. Let's flip the page and take a look at some of the seasonal trades here. So biotech sector from June 23rd until September the 13th. It often finishes up at strong seasonal period a little bit earlier on September 13th. If it's performing well, it can go all that way. But really, if we take a look here, I want to show you this chart here. Here's the biotech sector. This is from 1993 to 2021. Look at this strong performance in the month of July. The median's really high here, almost 6%. The average is almost 6% versus the S&P 500. 77% of the time positive and outperforms the S&P 500. 80% has outperformed the S&P 500 80% of the time. So that's the strongest month of the year for the biotech sector. It has been pulling back recently, and I'll show you that graph in a minute, so it could present an opportunity. Cameco, look at Cameco. So we can get some volatility in Cameco, and it starts, it has a weak seasonal period starting in early June. It has been performing extremely well recently. There's a lot of fundamental factors driving the price of uranium higher, increasing demand and shortage of supply, etc. But just watch out from a seasonal basis. This tends to be a little bit of a weaker time in June and July into early August here. And we can see here that on the monthly stats here as well. In this case, I'm using the CCO, the Canadian ticker symbol here. So July tends to be one of the weaker months for Cameco. So long-term fundamental strong case for Cameco, but it can also as well seasonally have a little bit of a weak spot coming up. Summer Sizzler. Now I want to talk about this because I showed you initially that graph at the beginning of when I flipped into my book here and showed you there's a little bit of an uptick on a seasonal basis at the end of June. And that can run into sort of like 2 weeks into July or even a little bit longer coming into the earnings season. So it's an amalgamation of different factors. End of month seasonal trade at the end of June. We have the Independence Day trade. Plus you have the earnings coming into Q2 as well. And so you tend to find that the stock market can do well in this time period. So the S&P 500 is a broad market as well. And that's particularly true if you have seen a big correction take place in the month of June. And you start to see an uptick coming into the last couple of days in June. So it's something to watch out for, especially if the right technical setup happens. If we flip the page once again, we go over to Oracle. Okay, so here's Oracle. Look, if there's 1 month of the year on average that you want to be invested in from a seasonal basis for Oracle, it really is June here. And let's just flip over here. We'll just show you this chart here. Look at the month of June for Oracle from 1990 to 2021. You've got Oracle up huge, the median, the average, 73% of the time positive. In this case, 80% of the time outperforming the S&P 500 in the month of June. And that has to do when Oracle's year-end finishes and what investors expect around the year-end finish. I want to show you, just jump into July for a second here. I want to just jump ahead and show you gold here, just to talk a little bit about gold. The seasonal period for July for gold starts on July the 12th. Now, June can present an interesting entry opportunity ahead of time in what we call the pre-buy window, pre-seasonal window, if we start to see some relative strength on volatility happening in the month of June. So something to watch out for. And the strongest, if we take a look here, really the strongest month of the year is September for gold, but there could be some interesting opportunities to get into gold early as well with the right conditions. I just want to show you some of the graphs of the sectors and stocks we talked about today on a seasonal basis. So we'll start with the biotech sector, ETF in the States, IBB, and this is IBB relative to the S&P 500 now. July tends to be that strong period for the biotech sector. If we go back and take a look here, we can see in 2022, we did see it actually, actually just before the start of the strong seasonal period, the biotech sector actually started to perform well. And let's go back to 2021. You can see here that June into July again was once again very strong for the biotech sector. And especially if we see a correction taking place ahead of time, and in this case, there's a little bit of a consolidation taking place before the beginning of the seasonal period. And what we've seen is we have seen that correction taking place for the biotech sector, which could be setting up for a good entry opportunity. Now, the biotech sector could perform very well in a seasonal period if the S&P 500 starts to get some traction and you start to see a rally take place. if the S&P 500 goes through a big corrective phase, maybe the biotech sector performs relatively well to the S&P 500, but it could still move down as well at the same time. But if we start to see the S&P 500 have a rally, especially if the biotech sectors pull back, we could see the sector actually perform quite well. This is a graph of Cameco. I'm using the ticker symbol in the States, CCJ, and this is CCJ relative to the S&P 500. If we take a look at Cameco, Cameco really has been in a bit of a consolidation over the last, well, a year and a half or so, and or a little bit longer. And recently we start to see this break a little bit above this level here that it was back in February, which is a positive sign. So we're seeing a little bit of interest in the sector overall. And look at this, just really relative to the S&P 500, we've seen this outperformance really back into 2020. And that's really partly because the fundamentals have been improving for Cameco as well. But once again, from a seasonal basis, it tends to pull back on average over the long term at this time. It doesn't mean it's not a good stock, but we could see a retrenchment here, everything else being equal. This graph of Oracle, and if we take a look here, this is Oracle relative to the S&P 500. Now remember I said June tends to be a strong month for Oracle. Well, we have seen Oracle actually perform quite well over the last 8 months or so relative to the S&P 500 and on an absolute basis. But let's go back and take a look at the month of June over the last couple of years. You can see here in 2022, it's actually down a little bit, but look at this. It was actually up relative to the S&P 500. And if we go back to 2021, we can see there was, well, in this case here, there was a lot of volatility happening, but it was slightly positive overall. And once again, from a lot of volatility, but performed quite well relative to the S&P 500. Let's go back and take a look in 2020 as well, positive in this time period, and also outperformed the S&P 500. Now, take a look here. We have seen a couple times where there has been some volatility for Oracle in the month of June. We'll pull back in June. This actually led to a good opportunity, just at least for the short term as well. But just something to watch out for. But definitely, on average, over the long term, June tends to be a strong month for Oracle. And just like I talked about for the biotech sector, if we do see the market go through a big corrective phase, Oracle could actually be pulled down from that. But if we see the tech stocks continue to run here in particular, and we see the S&P 500 show some strength, Oracle could continue to perform well. Also, I talked about gold as well today. So if we take a look here, gold starts a strong seasonal period in July. And I've got a couple other graphs here. Here's gold miners, GDX ETF that trades in the States. Here's the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, because when interest rates rise, it tends to present a greater opportunity cost to own gold. So it tends to be weaker against gold. Gold tends to be weaker as interest rates rise. And this last one is the US dollar relative to the world, a basket of currencies as well. If we take a look here on an absolute basis, starting in July, we can see here that we actually did okay, but initially here in 2022 into August, but then we did see that pullback take place. And we'll talk a little bit about the macros as well in a second. Once again, here's July again, and we saw a little bit ups and downs here, and mid-September it sort of just faded out in 2021. If we go back to 2020, we did see a strong rally that took place for gold as well. But let's take a look what was happening at the same time. And the reason I put GDX in here is that you can see that GDX tends to perform well, and this is on an absolute basis, if the stock market's moving up and gold as well. So it's just something also to track, or you can track the relative performance as well at the same time. I don't have it on here, the relative performance. I just have too many graphs here. But let's take a look here at what we saw here was interest rates rising in 2022 at that time here, and also as well the US dollar rising as well, partly because interest rates were rising. And at that time we saw gold actually heading down. And then in 2022 in October, so later in the year, we saw, in this case, interest rates start to fall and US dollar start to fall. And what we saw was gold put in a little bit of a bottom, and then it started to rally here as well. And you can see gold actually went up here as, in this case, interest rates went down a little bit, and also the US dollar went down a little bit. And we've seen a little bit of weakness recently for gold. as interest rates have moved higher as well, a little bit in the last month or so, and also the U.S. dollars moved higher as well. So we've seen, really a combination of factors, in this case, of these two factors really driving the price of gold as well. So something to track overall, to watch out for, but we are coming up to that strong seasonal period for gold, and I did, like I mentioned earlier, I will be writing about that in my next newsletter and taking a little bit of a focus on gold coming up shortly. I've also included a graph here of the S&P 500. If we take a look here at the S&P 500, what we've seen recently, we have seen some strength in the market. And the key line that everybody's been watching really has been 4,200. So we have seen a little bit of a breakout above that and on increasing volume. So we can't argue against that. That's actually a positive sign. Now, I'm not going to show the graph here. I don't want to get into all the technicals, but this market has been extremely narrow and really has been driven by 7 stocks recently. So it's not really a fair representation of what's taking place. But we're coming close to being overbought. We're slightly, you can see here, we didn't make overbought there. We just made it here as well. So when the S&P 500 becomes overbought outside of its favorable seasonal period, we can see a little bit of a correction taking place. And on a full stochastic oscillator basis, we can see here that it has become overbought but hasn't turned down yet. So just something to watch out for the S&P 500, particularly if the other sectors and stocks of the market really don't participate in this rally. We could see the S&P 500 vulnerable to some sort of softness or pullback in its weaker seasonal period here. So where do we stand in the month of June on a seasonal basis coming up? Well, if we take a look on a seasonal basis, June tends to be one of the weaker months of the year, and it does have a little bit of a run that can happen the first few days. But other than that, we tend to see a little bit of a softness in the month of June, leading to an opportunity really later on in the month of June for the broad market, for a lot of the sectors coming into earnings season as well. Now, the risk there is that if earnings don't come in as well as expected, we could see, perhaps that taper off early. But we generally see the stock market perform okay coming into earnings in all of the earnings months, actually January, April, July, and October. But maybe it peels away a little bit early. But I wouldn't be surprised to see what everybody calls a summer rally, which is really focused around the time before the earnings, Q2 earnings season. So it could happen this time around, but something to watch out for. On a sector basis, June's this funny month where we don't see a lot of sector leadership. Perhaps, maybe healthcare tends to be one of the stronger sectors, but we see this really not strong seasonal trends on both a average gain and a frequency basis as well. So different sectors can lead at different times. So it makes it very difficult on a sector basis to watch out to see which one's actually leading the market and moving from here. And we saw technology obviously being very strong in the month of May. We could see that change in the month of June. Sometimes what you see is as you move into new month, particularly in the unfavorable seasonal period, you can see the leading sectors actually rotate if there are concerns about the overall valuations of the market or the sectors of the market as well. So June's not a time to really be putting the pedal down to the metal as far as a seasonal basis, and even in the sectors as well. There is an opportunity on a seasonal basis coming up later in the month, perhaps to actually take advantage of the seasonal trend going into Q2 earnings as well. One of the sectors of the market that could present an interesting opportunity is gold. Now, it tends to be very volatile in the month of June. It tends to start a strong seasonal period in July, but it can start in June, particularly if it's pulled back. And we have seen a little bit of a pullback here recently as well. So we could see gold start to put in some sort of bottoming pattern here as well coming up. But, it's something to watch out for. And as I mentioned earlier, I will be writing about that in my next newsletter coming out shortly as well. Thank you very much for joining me today.